Welcome to Void of Rules. I was just looking at my channel analytics, and a shocking 85.5% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying these stories, consider hitting that subscribe button to help me reach 1K subscribers by the end of the year. It costs absolutely nothing, takes just 1 second, and you can always change your mind later. Drop a like on the video too. It really helps with the algorithm. Now let's jump into today's story. Ethan Holloway clutched the railing of the small fishing boat as it crashed through another wave, sending icy spray across his face. The mainland had long since disappeared behind them, swallowed by the thick blanket of fog that seemed to follow the vessel like a hungry predator. He tasted salt on his lips and felt the cold seep through his worn jacket, a stark reminder of how unprepared he was for what lay ahead. "You sure about this job, son?" Captain Morgan shouted over the roar of the engine and crashing waves. The old man's weathered face was pinched with concern as he guided the boat through the churning waters. His hands, knotted with arthritis and covered in old scars, gripped the wheel with practiced confidence despite the treacherous conditions. "Ain't many who last out at Blackwater." "I need the work," Ethan replied simply, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man with few options left. He ran a hand through his dark hair, still cut military short, despite being months removed from service. The truth was more complicated. After his dishonorable discharge from the Marines, Ethan's life had spiraled. The nightmares of what happened in that village overseas never stopped. The images of flames and screaming civilians haunted him nightly. A mission gone catastrophically wrong, all because he'd followed orders without question. Neither did the drinking that followed, nor the fights, nor the desperate scramble for jobs that never lasted. His last position, security at a downtown nightclub, had ended when he'd broken a patron's jaw during a flashback episode. No charges were pressed, but no referencer was provided either. When the email from Aegis Nautical Preservation appeared in his inbox offering twice the salary he'd ever made for Lighthouse keeper duties, Ethan hadn't questioned his good fortune. He'd responded within minutes, accepting the position before even reading the full job description. Now, staring at the jagged spire of black rock emerging from the mist ahead, he wasn't so sure. Something about the place triggered the same instinctive wariness he'd developed in combat zones. That prickling sensation at the back of his neck that whispered of danger. Blackwater Rock rose from the sea like the spine of some ancient, drowned beast. Jagged edges caught what little sunlight penetrated the clouds, glinting wetly like teeth. Atop its highest point sat the lighthouse, tall, Victorian, with weathered white paint peeling to reveal the dark stone beneath. The structure seemed to lean slightly, as though perpetually bracing against the winds that howled around it. From this distance, Ethan could see cracks in the masonry and rust staining the metal railings of the gallery that encircled the lantern room. "Nasty piece of rock, ain't it?" Captain Morgan commented, noticing Ethan's fixed gaze. "Been guiding ships around these parts for 30 years, and I still don't like coming close to it. Waters are always rougher near Blackwater, even when it's calm everywhere else." He spat over the side of the boat, like the sea's trying to keep folks away. They approached a small, rickety dock that clung to the base of the rock. The wooden structure looked ancient, its pilings green with algae and barnacles. It swayed precariously with each wave. "Can't stay past 4, Captain Morgan announced as they neared. "Tides get treacherous after dark. Nobody comes or goes from Blackwater at night." "Why not?" Ethan asked, gathering his few possessions. A duffel bag of clothes, a box of supplies, and a small photo frame he kept wrapped in a t-shirt. The captain's eyes narrowed, lines deepening at their corners. "Just how it is, company rules." Ethan nodded, hauling his duffel bag onto his shoulder as the boat bumped against the dock. The wood creaked beneath his boots as he stepped off, the entire structure swaying with the motion of the waves. He turned to help unload his supplies, but the captain was already pushing them toward him, eager to be away. "Anything else I should know?" Ethan asked, sensing the man's growing unease. Captain Morgan paused, one hand on the throttle. His eyes darted up to the lighthouse, then back to Ethan. "Remember what they tell you," the captain called, already reversing the boat. "The rules keep you breathing." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, the boat was pulling away, disappearing into the curtain of fog that encircled the island. The sound of the engine faded gradually, leaving only the crash of waves against rock and the distant cry of gulls. He was alone. Ethan stood for a moment, taking in his surroundings. The base of Blackwater Rock consisted of a small, rocky beach strewn with driftwood and the occasional piece of debris, remnants of ships that hadn't given the treacherous waters a wide enough berth. The air smelled of salt and decay, with an undercurrent of something else, something faintly metallic. The climb to the lighthouse was steep, a narrow path carved into the black rock that wound its way up the cliff face. Ethan shouldered his duffel and grabbed his box of supplies, beginning the ascent. The path was slick with spray, and more than once his foot slipped, sending small cascades of pebbles tumbling to the beach below. Halfway up, he had to stop to catch his breath, his legs burning from the effort. From this vantage point, he could see farther out to sea. The fog was thinning slightly, revealing waters that seemed unnaturally dark, as if the depths continued forever. No ships were visible on the horizon, no signs of life beyond the occasional seabird. Ethan felt a growing sense of isolation that was both comforting and disquieting. After months of failing to reintegrate into civilian society, part of him welcomed the solitude. Another part recognized the danger in being so completely cut off from the world. By the time Ethan reached the small plateau where the lighthouse stood, his legs burned and his breath came in sharp gasps. He set down his box and duffel, taking a moment to study his new home. Up close, the lighthouse was even more imposing. It stood nearly 100 feet tall, its white paint grey with age and salt. The stonework near the base was black, not from paint, but from the same strange rock that formed the island itself. The windows were dark, save for a single light burning in what appeared to be a kitchen on the ground floor. The massive lantern room at the top was dark, though Ethan could see the silhouette of the great lens within. A small outbuilding stood nearby, a storage shed from the looks of it, with a metal door secured by a heavy padlock. Beyond that, there was nothing but rock and sparse, windswept grass that somehow found purchase in the inhospitable terrain. Ethan approached the heavy wooden door of the lighthouse and raised his hand to knock, but it swung open before his knuckles could make contact. "You're late," said the old man who stood in the doorway. "Sun's already starting to set." Wallace Grayson looked to be in his 70s, with a wild mane of white hair and a beard that reached the middle of his chest. His face was deeply tanned and lined, bearing the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades staring out to sea. He wore a faded sweater with patches on the elbows and wool pants that had seen better days. His eyes, pale blue and watery, darted constantly over Ethan's shoulder to the darkening sky beyond. "Traffic on the Atlantic was terrible," Ethan replied dryly, but Wallace didn't smile. His face remained impassive, almost suspicious, as he looked at Ethan up and down. "Inside, now." The old man stepped back, gesturing impatiently. Ethan entered, and Wallace immediately slammed the door shut behind him, throwing 3 heavy iron bolts into place with practiced efficiency. The sound of metal sliding into place echoed in the circular room, oddly final. The interior of the lighthouse was unexpectedly cozy. The ground floor was a single circular room that served as a kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently home to a small, crackling fire that cast dancing shadows across the room. Worn but comfortable-looking furniture, a sofa, 2 armchairs, and a wooden dining table with chairs filled the space. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and curious objects. Shells, carved figurines, and what looked like animal bones, arranged in patterns Ethan couldn't quite discern. The kitchen area was simple but functional. A wood-burning stove, a sink with a hand pump, and cabinets that looked handmade. The smell of something cooking, stew from the aroma, filled the air, making Ethan's stomach growl. He hadn't realised how hungry he was. "Not much time," Wallace muttered, checking an ancient pocket watch that he pulled from his vest pocket. The case was tarnished silver, engraved with what looked like nautical symbols. "Sun's down in 22 minutes. Gotta get you settled." He led Ethan up a narrow spiral staircase to the second floor, which contained 2 small bedrooms on opposite sides of the circular space. A worn rug covered the wooden floor, and a single window looked out to sea. "That one's yours," Wallace pointed to the room on the right. The door stood open, revealing a simple bed, a nightstand, and a small dresser. "Mine's opposite. Don't come in without knocking. Ever." His tone left no room for argument. They continued up to the 3rd floor, which housed a small bathroom with an old clawfoot tub, a storage room filled with supplies, canned food, tools, lantern oil, and other necessities, and a workshop cluttered with tools and mechanical parts. Brass gears, springs, and what looked like pieces of clockwork mechanisms covered every surface. A half-disassembled motor sat on a workbench, surrounded by tools. "Maintenance room," Wallace explained hurriedly. "You'll need to learn the mechanics. Lantern can't go out. Not ever." He ran a hand over a complex-looking mechanism, with fondness, like a father patting a child's head. Finally, they climbed to the lantern room at the top. The great Fresnel lens stood in the centre, a marvel of prismatic glass and brass that had to be at least 6 feet tall. The lens was composed of hundreds of carefully crafted glass panels arranged in rings, designed to capture and magnify light to incredible distances. Through the windows that encircled the room, Ethan could see the ocean stretching to the horizon, in all directions, the water darkening as the sun began to dip below the horizon. "Most important part of the job," Wallace said, running a hand lovingly over the brass railing that surrounded the lens. "Light guides the ships away from the rocks, keeps them safe." He paused, his eyes locking with Ethan's. "Keeps us safe too." Wallace lit the lantern, a process that involved opening a small door in the base of the apparatus, lighting a wick inside, and adjusting several valves that controlled the flow of oil. The light blazed to life, surprisingly bright, and began to rotate slowly thanks to a clockwork mechanism underneath. "Gotta be maintained every 4 hours, Wallace explained. "Oil checked, wick trimmed, mechanism wound. I'll show you properly tomorrow, but remember, if it goes out, you've got 30 seconds to relight it." "Or what?" Ethan asked. Wallace didn't answer, instead turning to head back down the stairs. On their way back down, Ethan noticed a heavy metal door beside the workshop, secured with a large padlock. Unlike the rest of the lighthouse, which seemed primarily functional with its occasional decorative touches, this door looked almost fortified, with multiple locks and what appeared to be symbols carved into the frame. "What's down there?" he asked, pausing to examine the strange markings. They resembled no writing system he recognized, yet somehow seemed to suggest meanings just beyond his comprehension. Wallace's face hardened, a shuttered look coming over his features. "Basement? Off limits. No need to go down there." He moved past Ethan, continuing down the stairs without further explanation. Back in the kitchen, Wallace poured 2 cups of coffee so strong Ethan could smell it from across the room. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he slid 1 cup across the table. Ethan noticed that the old keeper's fingernails were bitten to the quick, and dark half-moons of dirt or grease were permanently embedded beneath them. "Listen carefully," Wallace said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, though they were the only 2 people for miles. "This ain't just a job, it's a duty. a responsibility. His eyes tracked to the window where darkness was rapidly falling. A burden, he added, so quietly Ethan almost missed it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. The cover was cracked and stained, with the words, "The Rules," scratched deeply into the leather. The binding was frayed, suggesting it had been opened and closed countless times over many years. "Everything you need to know is in here," Wallace said, pushing the notebook toward Ethan. "Follow them, no exceptions, no questions." Ethan opened the notebook. The first page contained a list written in faded ink, the handwriting neat but cramped, as if the writer had been trying to fit as much information as possible into a limited space. 1. Never leave the lighthouse after sunset. No matter what you hear, do not open the door. 2. Keep the lantern burning at all times. If it goes out, light it again within 30 seconds, or it will come inside. 3. You will hear knocking on the windows at night. Do not look. Do not acknowledge it. 4. Every night at 3:12 a.m, a bell will ring from the fog. Do not answer it. 5. Sometimes the supply boat will arrive at the wrong time. If the crew has no faces, do not take anything from them. 6. Wallace will disappear from time to time. If he returns but something feels off, lock yourself in the storage room until sunrise. 7. If you wake up and the ocean is completely silent, pray. The margins around the rules were filled with scribbled notes, additions, and what looked like bloodstains. Some notes appeared to be written in different handwriting, suggesting multiple authors had added to the notebook over time. Near Rule 3, someone had written, "They'll whisper names you know. Don't listen." By Rule 4, "The bell is sweetest when you're most tired. Stay awake." And beside Rule 7, in shaky writing, "If it happens, you're already too late." Ethan flipped through the notebook. The remaining pages contained detailed observations, diagrams of the lighthouse's mechanical systems, star charts, tide tables, and what looked like a log of incidents dating back decades. "This is a joke, right?" Ethan laughed, looking up at Wallace. "Some kind of initiation prank?" His military experience had included plenty of hazing rituals for newcomers, and this seemed elaborate enough to be one of them. The humour died in his throat when he saw Wallace's expression. The old man's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with a fear so genuine it made Ethan's skin crawl. The hand holding his coffee cup trembled so violently that dark liquid sloshed over the rim, but Wallace didn't seem to notice. "Mock them if you want," Wallace said, his voice barely audible. "They'll still be there when you're begging for dawn." The old keeper glanced at his pocket watch again and stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste. "Sunset in 5 minutes. I need to be in my quarters." He moved towards the stairs, then paused, looking back at Ethan. "Remember Rule 6, especially about me." With that, Wallace disappeared up the stairs, leaving Ethan alone with the notebook and his cooling coffee. Moments later, Ethan heard the sound of a door closing and multiple locks engaging. Silence descended on the lighthouse, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore and the occasional creak of the structure as it settled. Ethan sipped his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste, and flipped back to the first page of the notebook. The rules seemed absurd. No faceless crew, Wallace disappearing, a bell at exactly 3:12 a.m. It had to be a prank, or perhaps the delusions of an old man driven half mad by isolation. Yet the fear in Wallace's eyes had been real, and Captain Morgan's parting words echoed in Ethan's mind. "The rules keep you breathing." Ethan spent the next hour familiarizing himself with the lighthouse, trying to ignore the growing unease that settled over him as darkness fell. He unpacked his meager possessions, placing the small frame photo on the nightstand beside his bed, a picture of himself and a young woman with auburn hair, both smiling in front of a Christmas tree. Jessica, his ex-fiancée, who couldn't handle his post-combat changes and had left 6 months after his discharge. He kept the photo not out of hope for reconciliation, but as a reminder of what his actions had cost him. The rules were obviously superstition, he told himself as he explored. Wallace was probably just an old man whose mind had been warped by too many years alone on a rock in the middle of nowhere. Ethan had seen real horrors in combat. Men torn apart by IEDs, villages burned to the ground, civilians caught in crossfire. Whatever dangers lurked in an old lighthouse couldn't compare. Still, as night fully descended and the wind picked up, howling around the lighthouse with an almost human quality, Ethan found himself glancing repeatedly at the bolted door. The fire in the hearth cast long shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames, and the darkness beyond the windows felt oppressive, as if it were pressing against the glass, searching for a way in. Ethan settled into one of the armchairs with a book from the shelf, a volume on maritime history that looked well read. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its brass pendulum swinging in hypnotic rhythm. Outside, the beam from the lantern swept across the water in regular intervals, briefly illuminating the churning waves before darkness reclaimed them. At 9:37 p.m, the first knock came. It was soft, almost tentative, a gentle rapping against the kitchen window. Ethan, who had been reading about a shipwreck near Blackwater Rock in 1887, froze. The knocking came again, slightly louder, more insistent. 3 distinct knocks, precisely spaced. Rule 3. You will hear knocking on the windows at night. Do not look. Do not acknowledge it. Just the wind, Ethan muttered to himself, though he knew the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be branches or debris. There was nothing near the lighthouse that could make such a sound naturally. No trees, no loose shutters, nothing but stone and glass. The knocking moved, travelling around the circular wall of the lighthouse, tapping at each window in turn before returning to the first. It grew more insistent with each circuit, the gentle tap 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 evolving into a desperate pounding that shook the glass. Between knocks, Ethan thought he heard something else, a whispering, too faint to make out words, but with the cadence of human speech. Ethan's curiosity battled with his growing fear. What harm could come from just a quick peek? He rose from his chair, moving slowly toward the window, where the knocking had started. The pounding intensified as he approached, as if whatever was outside knew he was coming. As his hand reached for the curtain, a flicker of movement caught his eye. The light coming through the windows had changed, or rather, disappeared. The lantern room at the top of the lighthouse had gone dark. Rule 2. Keep the lantern burning at all times. If it goes out, light it again within 30 seconds, or it will come inside. Panic surged through Ethan. He abandoned the window and sprinted for the spiral staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. The darkness in the stairwell was absolute, forcing him to feel his way up, hands sliding along the cold stone wall. Behind him, the knocking intensified, becoming a frenzied hammering that echoed throughout the lighthouse. Ethan counted the seconds in his head as he climbed. 15, 20. The darkness pressed in around him, thick and smothering. Something brushed against his face. A cobweb, he told himself. Nothing more. But it felt wet, like fingers trailing across his cheek. He burst into the lantern room, breathless. The great lens was dark, the flame extinguished. The clockwork still turned, rotating the lifeless apparatus with a soft clicking that seemed obscenely loud in the silence. Ethan scrambled for the box of matches, kept beside the lantern, his hands shaking as he struck one. The match flared to life, illuminating the lantern room in a small circle of wavering light. 25 seconds. In the small glow, Ethan caught a glimpse of what waited outside the glass. A face, or something like a face, pressed against the window, watching him, with eyes like black pits in a pallid mask. The features seemed to shift and flow, never quite settling into anything recognizable as human. Ethan dropped the match with a strangled cry. In the renewed darkness, he could hear a sound like nails dragging across the glass. He fumbled for another match, struck it, and this time successfully lit the lantern wick. 29 seconds. The warm glow filled the room, growing in brightness as the flame stabilized. The lens began to magnify the light, sending powerful beams out across the water. When Ethan dared to look at the windows again, there was nothing there but the reflection of the light against the darkness. No face, no eyes, no scratching fingers, just his own pale reflection, wide-eyed with fear. He stood for several minutes, heart hammering in his chest, before venturing back down the stairs. The knocking had stopped. The lighthouse was silent, save for the regular sweep of the light above and the muffled sound of waves below. In the kitchen, Ethan opened the notebook again, studying the rules with new respect. Wallace's scribbled notes in the margins took on new significance. They're always watching. The light burns them. They want in, don't let them in. On a page near the back, Ethan found a rough sketch of what looked like the thing he'd seen. A vaguely humanoid shape, with features that seemed to melt and shift. Beneath it was written, "They wear familiar faces when they can. Trust nothing you see outside after dark." Ethan's military training kicked in. The familiar routine of threat assessment and security checks providing some comfort. He systematically checked every window, ensuring curtains were drawn. He stoked the fire, banking it for the night, and filled a lantern with oil to keep by his bed. The routine helped calm his racing heart, gave him a sense of control in a situation that defied rational explanation. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by strange dreams of drowning and distant bells. In one dream, he stood on the gallery that encircled the lantern room, looking out over a sea that had turned to glass. On the horizon, an enormous shape rose from the water, too distant to make out clearly, but vast beyond comprehension. It moved towards the lighthouse with terrible purpose, and Ethan found himself unable to move, frozen in place as it approached. Just as it drew near enough to see, a bell rang, jerking him awake. When Ethan finally woke fully, sunlight was streaming through the windows, revealing intricate patterns etched into the glass. Not frost, but what looked like claw marks arranged in circular, swirling designs. They covered every window in his room, delicate whorls and spirals that caught the light like crystal. Wallace appeared in the doorway of Ethan's room, carrying a tray with eggs, toast and coffee. His demeanor was entirely changed from the previous evening. Relaxed, almost jovial, as if the fearful old man had been replaced by someone else. "Morning," the old man said, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Sleep well?" "The knocking," Ethan began, sitting up in bed. "What was—" "Best not to talk about night things in the day," Wallace interrupted, setting down the tray. "Draws attention. Eat up, got work to do." As they ate, Wallace chatted about mundane lighthouse business, the weather forecast, maintenance tasks that needed attention, their supply situation. He gave no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred, and deflected Ethan's attempts to bring up the rules or the strange occurrences of the night before. "Been keeping this light for 47 years, Wallace said, sipping his coffee. "Started as assistant keeper under old Harrison. Learned everything from him." His eyes clouded briefly. "He didn't last long after breaking Rule 4. Answered that damn bell." "What happened to him?" Ethan asked. Wallace's expression darkened. "Found him in the lantern room at dawn. Or what was left of him." He stood abruptly. "Enough talk. Tide's out. Need to check the foundations." The day passed in a blur of maintenance tasks. Wallace taught Ethan how to care for the lantern, clean the lens, and maintain the clockwork mechanism that rotated it. The old keeper was surprisingly knowledgeable about the complex machinery, demonstrating how to adjust the gears for optimal rotation. and how to troubleshoot common problems. Lighthouse was built in 1853, Wallace explained as they worked. Original mechanism still works perfectly if you treat it right. Can't say the same for these modern automated lights. They break down when you need them most. All the while, the old keeper kept one eye on the water, as if expecting something to emerge from its depths. Whenever a shadow passed over the sun, causing the light to dim momentarily, Wallace would tense, his hand moving unconsciously to a knife he kept sheathed at his belt. During a break, Ethan explored the lighthouse more thoroughly, finding hidden corners and crawl spaces that Wallace hadn't shown him. In one such space, tucked behind a loose stone in the wall of the maintenance room, he discovered a cache of journals, records kept by previous keepers. Some dated back nearly a century, their pages yellow and brittle with age. Stealing away to his room with several of the journals, Ethan began to read. The accounts told a chilling story. Keeper after keeper described the same phenomena. The knocking, the bell at 3:12 a.m., the faceless crew. Those who broke the rules wrote of horrifying consequences. Visions of drowning while on dry land, visitations from loved ones long dead, and transformations that defied natural law. One journal, belonging to a keeper named Daniel Mills from the 1890s, contained a newspaper clipping about the tragic accident that claimed the lives of 3 lighthouse keepers on Blackwater Rock. The official report blamed a storm, but Mills had scrawled across the article, "No storm, they looked outside." Another keeper, Samuel Brooks, wrote extensively about the bell. April 17th, 1912. The bell came again last night. So beautiful, so clear. When I close my eyes, I can still hear it calling. Harrison says never to answer it, but what harm could come from just listening more closely? Perhaps tonight I'll open the window, just a crack. The entry ended there. The next entry, dated a week later, was in a different handwriting. Harrison's, presumably. Noting that Brooks answered the bell, found nothing but his boots on the gallery at dawn. Taking on Grayson as assistant keeper tomorrow. Need the help. Grayson, Wallace's surname. Ethan flipped forward through the journal, finding entries that confirmed his suspicion. Wallace had indeed come to Blackwater Rock in 1977, 47 years ago, just as he'd said at breakfast. But according to the journal, Wallace had been in his 30s then, which would make him nearly 80 now. The old man didn't look a day over 70, despite his white hair and weathered appearance. As Ethan continued his exploration, he noticed strange markings carved into the foundation stones of the lighthouse, symbols similar to those on the basement door. Intricate patterns that resembled no language he recognized, but nonetheless seemed to suggest meanings just beyond his comprehension. Some of the symbols appeared to match those in the margins of the rules notebook. Even more disturbing was his growing awareness that the lighthouse's construction was somehow wrong. As a Marine, Ethan had developed an instinctive understanding of spaces and distances necessary for navigation and combat. But in the lighthouse, that sense was disrupted. Certain angles didn't quite match up. Rooms seemed larger inside than their external dimensions should allow, and sometimes when Ethan stood at the base of the spiral staircase and looked up, he could swear the stairs twisted in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. That evening, Wallace prepared a hearty fish stew, the 2 men eating in relative silence as darkness fell outside. The old keeper grew increasingly agitated as the sun set, checking his pocket watch frequently and glancing at the windows with barely disguised dread. "Got to wind the mechanism before full dark," he finally said, pushing me away his half-empty bowl. "You should get some rest. Take first sleep shift. I'll wake you at midnight for lantern duty." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "And remember the rules. All of them." That night, Ethan was better prepared. He lit extra lamps around the kitchen, checked and rechecked the lantern, and kept the notebook of rules close at hand. He tried to sleep knowing he'd need to be alert for his midnight shift, but rest proved elusive. Every creak of the lighthouse, every whistle of wind, kept him teetering on the edge of consciousness. The knocking began at the same time, 9:37 p.m. This time, Ethan didn't approach the windows. He sat rigid in his bed, focusing on his breathing as the desperate pounding moved around the lighthouse. The pattern was the same as the previous night, starting gently, growing more insistent, cycling around the structure. New sounds joined the knocking, scratching like nails on stone, and occasionally what sounded like whispering in a language that made Ethan's ears hurt. Sometimes the whispers seemed to form words he almost recognized, fragments of conversations from his past. "Ethan, please." That was Jessica's voice, pleading just as she had the night she'd left. "Holloway, get down." His sergeant, moments before the explosion that had killed him. "Help me." A child from the village, voice high with terror. Ethan pressed his hands over his ears, but the voices seemed to bypass them entirely, speaking directly into his mind. "Not real," he muttered to himself. "Not real." At midnight, Wallace knocked on his door. The old man looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot. "Your shift," he said simply. "Keep it burning." Ethan climbed to the lantern room where he spent 4 hours, maintaining the light and trying to ignore the occasional flicker of movement he caught in his peripheral vision. Shapes in the darkness beyond the glass that vanished when he turned to look directly at them. Once he thought he saw a massive shadow pass beneath the surface of the water, large enough to disturb the waves despite the calm night. At 3:12 a.m, exactly, just as the rule predicted, a bell rang from somewhere in the fog. The sound was beautiful, crystalline, and pure, unlike any bell Ethan had ever heard. It called to him, drawing him toward the door with a longing he couldn't explain. A promise of peace, of an end to nightmares, of forgiveness for all he'd done wrong. Rule 4. Every night at 3:12 a.m, a bell will ring from the fog. Do not answer it. Ethan dug his nails into his palms, using the pain to anchor himself against the bell's allure. The sweet tones continued for exactly 3 minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt expectant, as if something waited just beyond the glass for his response. Outside, something massive moved in the water surrounding the island. Though he couldn't see it clearly through the fog, Ethan caught glimpses of an enormous shadow passing beneath the surface, fluid and shapeless one moment, terrifyingly defined the next. The water around it seemed to boil, though there was no heat, only movement. As it circled the lighthouse, the knocking intensified, and the whispers grew more desperate. A scream tore through the night. Wallace from his quarters downstairs. The old man's cry was abruptly cut short, leaving a silence more frightening than any noise. Rule 6, Wallace will disappear from time to time. If he returns but something feels off, lock yourself in the storage room until sunrise. Ethan didn't hesitate. He bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in his haste. The door to Wallace's room stood open, but the room was empty. The old man's bed was rumpled, the sheets twisted as if he'd been struggling. A single slipper lay on the floor, its mate nowhere to be seen. Ethan continued down to the 3rd floor and locked himself in the storage room, wedging a chair under the doorknob for good measure. The small space was cramped but secure, with no windows and only the single door. He lit a small lantern, casting a warm glow that pushed back the darkness but couldn't dispel the fear that had taken root in his chest. For hours he sat in the dimness, listening to the sounds that filtered through the door. Footsteps circled the storage room, too heavy to be Wallace's, with an odd, dragging quality that suggested something not quite walking on legs. Occasionally something scratched at the door, and whispers seeped through the cracks, words that shouldn't have been understandable, but somehow made a terrible kind of sense. "Let us in, keeper. We're so hungry. The light burns, but darkness feeds." Your friend answered the bell. So will you, in time. Ethan pressed his back against the far wall, clutching the rules notebook like a talisman. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness, marked only by the gradual change in the quality of light seeping under the door as night gave way to dawn. When sunrise finally came, Ethan emerged cautiously. The lighthouse was quiet, sunlight streaming through windows that once again bore those strange, swirling patterns. All trace of the previous night's disturbances had vanished, save for those etchings and the rumpled state of Wallace's bed. The old keeper was nowhere to be found. Ethan searched the lighthouse thoroughly, calling Wallace's name with increasing desperation. The old man's boots and coat remained in their place by the door. His half-empty coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table, but of Wallace himself there was no sign. Finally, Ethan searched the old keeper's quarters, looking for any clue to what had happened. What he found instead was evidence that Wallace had been on Blackwater Rock far longer than a few decades. As he found instead was evidence that Wallace had been on Blackwater Rock far longer than a few decades, as he'd claimed. Photographs on the wall showed Wallace in the same lighthouse dating back to the 1970s, 47 years of service, just as the journals had indicated. Yet in the earliest photos, Wallace appeared almost the same age as he did now. In one faded colour photograph from 1977, a younger man, presumably Harrison, the previous headkeeper, stood beside Wallace at the lighthouse door. While Wallace had aged somewhat, the difference between the young assistant in the photo and the old man Ethan had met was far less than 47 years would suggest. More disturbing were the photographs that followed. Every few years a new assistant keeper appeared in the pictures, standing alongside Wallace. Some smiled, some looked wary. None appeared in more than 2 or 3 photos before being replaced by another face. A dozen keepers at least had come and gone while Wallace remained. On the old man's desk, Ethan found a personal journal, its leather cover worn smooth from handling. The latest entry was dated the previous day. New keeper arrived today. Holloway. Ex-military. Like most they send us. Damaged goods. They always choose the broken ones. Easier to sacrifice, I suppose. No one misses them. I've been here too long, seen too many come and go, or stay in their own way. The thing beneath grows stronger. The rules barely hold it anymore. Last month, Richards only made it 2 weeks before answering the bell. At least that was clean. Jenkins before him broke Rule 3, looked outside. What came back wearing his face lasted 3 days, before I had to use the axe. Aegis doesn't care about ships, never did. The lighthouse doesn't warn vessels away from danger. It contains something beneath it, something ancient, something hungry. The light doesn't guide ships to safety. It keeps the darkness at bay. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry for the next keeper. I'm breaking Rule 7 tonight. Ethan's blood ran cold. He flipped through earlier entries, piecing together a horrifying truth. Aegis Nautical Preservation had been sending keepers to Blackwater Rock for generations, not as lighthouse operators, but as sacrifices or guardians for something imprisoned beneath. According to Wallace's journal, the lighthouse had been built not to warn ships of dangerous waters, but to contain whatever dwelled around Blackwater Rock. The light itself was a prison of sorts, its specially designed lens focusing not just visible light, but some other quality that kept the entities at bay. When the light went out, even briefly, the containment weakened, and the rules? They weren't superstitions, but survival mechanisms, developed over decades of deadly trial and error by generations of keepers. Each rule addressed a specific threat or vulnerability in the lighthouse's defences. Ethan sat heavily on Wallace's bed, the journal open in his trembling hands. The implications were staggering. He wasn't here to operate a lighthouse. He was a warden, a sacrifice, a stopgap measure against something far beyond his understanding. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a boat engine. Rushing to the window, Ethan saw a small vessel approaching the dock. The supply boat, but according to the schedule Wallace had shown him, it wasn't due for another week. Rule 5, sometimes the supply boat will arrive at the wrong time. If the crew has no faces, do not take anything from them. The boat docked and 3 figures in yellow rain slickers disembarked, carrying crates. From this distance, Ethan couldn't make out their features. This could be his chance to escape, to leave this nightmare behind. He could be on that boat and heading back to the mainland within minutes. But as the figures began climbing the path to the lighthouse, something about their movements made Ethan hesitate. They walked with an unnatural synchronicity, as if controlled by a single mind. Their steps had a fluid quality that reminded him of how the shadows had moved in the water the night before, and their faces. Ethan grabbed a pair of binoculars from the desk. What he saw made his stomach lurch. Where faces should have been, there were only blurs. Shifting, swirling masses of flesh with occasional features that appeared and disappeared like faces seen in clouds. One moment, eyes and mouth would form in a semblance of humanity, only to dissolve and reform elsewhere on the head-like appendage. As the faceless crew neared the lighthouse, Ethan retreated from the window. His mind raced with options. He could barricade himself in, refusing to open the door, but how long could he last alone? The lantern needed constant maintenance, and he would have to sleep eventually. He could try to signal for help, but who would see? And even if they did, would the faceless crew allow another boat to approach? Or he could make a run for it, try to reach the boat while its inhuman crew was occupied with the lighthouse. But if he failed, if they caught him outside after he'd seen their true nature? The first knock came at the door. The same rhythmic pattern Ethan had heard on the windows at night. He stood frozen, watching through the peephole as their not-quite faces seemed to stare back at him, knowing he was there. One of the creatures held up a clipboard with a delivery manifest, tapping a pen against it expectantly. Another gestured to the crates they had brought, supplies ostensibly, though Ethan had no intention of finding out what they really contained. After several minutes, they set down the crates and returned to their boat, but they didn't leave. Instead, they circled the island until nightfall, their hollow gazes never leaving the lighthouse, as if waiting for something. That night, the knocking was more insistent than ever, and the whispers more articulate. The voice that had been Jessica's now called to him by name, begging him to just look just for a moment. The bell at 3:12 a.m. rang with such sweet clarity that Ethan had to bind his hands to the chair to prevent himself from answering it. A week passed. Ethan maintained the lighthouse, followed the rules, and searched for Wallace, though he knew the old keeper was gone for good. The journals and Wallace's notes provided enough instruction for him to keep the lantern burning and the mechanisms functioning, but isolation and sleep deprivation began to take their toll. Sleep became a luxury he could rarely afford, and when exhaustion finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with drowning and bells and faces that melted like wax. Sometimes he woke to find himself sleepwalking, hand outstretched toward a window or the door, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Food supplies dwindled, the regular delivery that Wallace had mentioned never came, and Ethan was reluctant to use what had been left by the faceless crew. He rationed the remaining provisions, subsisting on canned beans and stale crackers, supplemented by fish he caught from the rocks during daylight hours. On the 7th night, disaster struck. A violent storm hit Blackwater Rock, lightning crashing against the lighthouse and waves climbing halfway up the cliff. The wind howled with voices that seemed almost human, screaming obscenities and pleas in equal measure. In the lantern room, Ethan fought to keep the light burning against the gale that howled through tiny gaps in the windows. The lamp sputtered as rainwater found its way inside, each flicker sending shadows dancing across the walls. A particularly violent lightning strike hit the lighthouse directly. The entire structure shook, glass rattling in the windows, and for a terrifying moment, Ethan thought the tower might collapse. When the tremor subsided, the lantern went out. Panic seized Ethan as he fumbled for matches. His hands shook from a combination of fear and exhaustion, and the first match broke as he tried to strike it. The second was damp and wouldn't light. Outside, something massive rose from the churning waters, a darkness deeper than the storm. Rule 2, keep the lantern burning at all times. If it goes out, light it again within 30 seconds, or it will come inside. Ethan struck a third match. 20 seconds had passed. The match flared, then died in a sudden draft that shouldn't have been possible in the enclosed lantern room. Something scraped against the outside wall of the lighthouse, working its way up towards the lantern room. Through the rain-streaked glass, Ethan could see enormous shapes moving in the water, rising toward the lighthouse with terrible purpose. The fourth match. 25 seconds. Ethan cupped his hands around it, protecting the small flame, as he brought it to the lantern wick. The flame caught just as something dark and fluid began seeping through the seams of the windows. At 29 seconds, the lantern blazed to life, and the intruding darkness retreated, with a sound like a scream. The shapes in the water sank back beneath the waves, and the storm began to abate, as if it had been centered on that moment of vulnerability. But Ethan knew it was too late. Something had gotten inside. He saw no immediate evidence of intrusion, but as he descended the stairs, he noticed a subtle change in the lighthouse. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. The air felt thicker, as if saturated with some invisible presence. And occasionally, from the corner of his eye, he caught glimpses of movement, a darkness that flowed along the walls like living ink, always just out of direct sight. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, back to the wall, a knife in one hand and the rules notebook in the other. The knocking came as usual, but with a new confidence, as if whatever was outside knew it had gained ground. He awoke the next morning slumped in the chair, the knife fallen from his grasp. He had no memory of falling asleep, which terrified him more than anything else. What had happened while he was unconscious? What rules might he have broken without knowing? Ethan went to the window. Outside, the ocean was perfectly still, like glass. Not a ripple disturbed its surface, despite the fact that the waters around Blackwater Rock were never calm. No wind blew, no birds called, no waves crashed against the rocks. The world beyond the lighthouse had fallen into an unnatural silence. Rule 7. If you wake up and the ocean is completely silent, pray. A cold dread settled over Ethan. According to Wallace's journal, this was the final stage, the complete silence that preceded the end. Had the old keeper experienced this same terrifying stillness before he disappeared? A floorboard creaked behind him. Ethan turned to find Wallace standing in the doorway. "Morning," the old keeper said, his voice oddly precise, lacking the gruff warmth of before. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Relief flooded through Ethan, followed immediately by suspicion. Rule 6. If Wallace returns but something feels off, lock yourself in the storage room until sunrise. And something was definitely off. Wallace stood too straight, his usual stooped posture gone. His eyes, once pale blue and watery, were now a deeper blue, almost violet, and he didn't blink. Not once as he stood there, smiling a smile that stretched just a little too wide. "Where have you been?" Ethan asked, slowly backing toward the door. "Checking the foundations," Not Wallace replied, his smile growing wider. His teeth looked different, more numerous, somehow, and sharper. The lighthouse needs solid foundations, deep ones, ancient ones. "What's beneath the lighthouse, Wallace?" Not Wallace's smile grew impossibly wider, splitting his face in a way that no human mouth could manage. "Would you like to see?" In a movement too fast to follow, the thing wearing Wallace's skin lunged forward, grabbing Ethan's wrist with a hand that felt like cold, wet clay. Its face began to shift, features melting and reforming into something that resembled Wallace, only in the vaguest sense. "The lighthouse is not a prison for what's outside," it said, its voice changing, deepening into something that resonated in Ethan's bones. "It's a feeding ground. The rules don't keep us out. They regulate the feeding cycle." The thing's grip tightened, its flesh flowing around Ethan's wrist like water. Its other hand reached for his face, fingers elongating into tentacle-like appendages that writhed with purpose. "Your kind built this tower to keep us contained," it continued, its voice now a chorus of many speaking in unison. "But you didn't understand. We were already here. We've always been here. In the deep places, in the dark water, in the spaces between your thoughts." With a desperate surge of strength, Ethan tore himself free and ran, leaving a chunk of the creature's fluid flesh still clinging to his arm. He didn't stop until he reached the storage room, slamming the door and barricading it with everything he could move. For hours, he listened to the thing that wasn't Wallace moving through the lighthouse, occasionally scratching at the door or whispering promises and threats. It seemed to grow more numerous. Sometimes he heard multiple voices, multiple footsteps, as if the single entity had split into many. "We need a keeper, Ethan," it called through the door. "The light must be maintained. That's the bargain. Has always been the bargain." "What bargain?" Ethan shouted back against his better judgment. The thing laughed, a sound like water rushing over stones. "The one your kind made centuries ago. We allow your ships safe passage. We don't rise from the deep to reclaim what was once ours. And in return, you give us a keeper. Someone to tend the light. Someone to feed us slowly. Sustain us with their fear, their isolation, their despair. A sacrifice that lasts." When it finally went quiet, Ethan emerged cautiously. The lighthouse was empty, but the basement door stood open, the padlock broken. The symbols carved around the frame seemed to writhe with a life of their own, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Against every instinct, Ethan descended the dark stairs. The basement was a single circular room, its walls lined with alcoves, filled with strange artifacts, bottles containing what looked like preserved organs, sculptures made of bone and coral, and hundreds of photographs showing lighthouse keepers throughout the decades. In some photos, the keepers looked normal. In others, their features had begun to shift, taking on the fluid quality Ethan had seen in Not Wallace. And in the final photos of each series, what stared back at the camera was clearly no longer human, though it wore a human shape like an ill-fitting suit. In the center of the room was a well, its stone rim worn smooth by time. Ethan approached it slowly, his flashlight revealing no bottom to its depths. The water within was black and still, reflecting nothing, not even the light he shone upon it. A journal lay beside the well, Wallace's. The final entries revealed the terrible truth. The thing beneath Blackwater Rock was ancient, predating human civilization. It fed on fear, on isolation, on despair, the negative emotions that lighthouse keepers experienced and in abundance. According to Wallace, the lighthouse had been built as part of a pact. Centuries ago, when ships began to frequent these waters in greater numbers, they drew the attention of the ancient entities that dwelled in the deep. The creatures began to take the vessels, dragging them down to watery graves. In desperation, a group of educated men, Wallace's term for what Ethan assumed were occultists or practitioners of forgotten arts, made contact with the entities and struck a bargain. The lighthouse would be built, its special lens designed not just to warn ships, but to contain the creatures within a certain boundary. In return, the entities would allow safe passage to vessels that stayed within the light's guidance. But there was a price. The lighthouse required a keeper, someone to maintain the light and the ritual boundaries, and that keeper would belong to the things in the deep. The rules weren't meant to protect the keepers, but to create a sustainable feeding cycle. Those who followed them lasted longer, providing a steady supply of emotional sustenance. Those who broke them were consumed entirely, or worse, transformed. Wallace had become one of them years ago. The real Wallace Grayson had broken Rule 7 in 1983, walking into the silent sea. What returned wore his face and continued his duties, maintaining the lighthouse and inducting new keepers into the cycle. Wallace's journal entries after that date had been written by the thing that took his form, maintaining the charade for the benefit of new keepers and, perhaps, for its own amusement. Now Ethan understood why Aegis chose people like him. Isolated, troubled individuals with nowhere else to go. No one would miss them when they disappeared or question their gradual transformation. With grim determination, Ethan formed a plan. If the lighthouse contained something, then perhaps destroying it would end the cycle. His marine training hadn't been entirely forgotten. Given enough fuel and the right spark, the entire structure could burn. The wooden interior would go up quickly, and while the stone might stand, the mechanisms and the special lens would be destroyed. As darkness fell, Ethan gathered kerosene from the maintenance room, preparing to douse the wooden interior of the lighthouse. But the entities sensed his intentions. The knocking began earlier than usual, more frantic than ever before. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the inside of the windows despite the summer night. And then Not Wallace returned, accompanied by the faceless crew. They moved through the locked door as if it were mist, their forms fluid and unstable in the dim light. "The cycle continues, Keeper," Not Wallace said, its voice now a chorus of many. "It always continues." Ethan struck a match, ready to drop it into the kerosene-soaked floor, but Not Wallace moved with impossible speed, becoming a blur of motion that knocked Ethan against the wall. The match fell but landed away from the fuel. "You cannot destroy what has always been here," the thing said, its features rippling like water. "The lighthouse rose around us, not we within it." From the fog outside came the sound of the bell, not at 3:12 a.m, but hours earlier. Its tone had changed, becoming deeper, resonant with malice. "You're like all the others," Not Wallace said, its body beginning to lose cohesion, melting into something far less human. "You think you can fight it. You think you can escape. But there is no escape from Blackwater Rock. Only transformation." As Ethan struggled to his feet, the thing in Wallace's form approached, its body beginning to lose cohesion, melting into something far less human. "Join us, Keeper," it said, reaching for him with hands that stretched and flowed like dark water. "Become part of the light." Ethan's last conscious thought was that perhaps this had always been inevitable. The light must be maintained, the bargain must be kept, and Blackwater Rock would always have its keeper. 3 months later, a small fishing boat approached Blackwater Rock. Captain Morgan guided the vessel carefully through the fog, his weathered face grim as he studied the lighthouse above. A young woman stood at the bow, her eyes fixed on the structure that would be her home for the foreseeable future. The job listing from Aegis Nautical Preservation had been a godsend. Twice the salary she'd ever made, and a chance to escape the mess her life had become after her medical discharge from the army. The nightmares about the field hospital in Afghanistan, the faces of those she couldn't save, had made civilian life unbearable. "You sure about this job?" Morgan called to her, echoing the same question he'd asked Ethan Holloway and dozens of keepers before him. "I need the work," she replied simply. As they neared the dock, a figure appeared at the base of the cliff, a man in a lighthouse keeper's uniform, waving in greeting. "That'll be Holloway," Morgan said, "the current keeper." The woman frowned. "I thought I was replacing him." Morgan shrugged. "Sometimes they stay on to train the new ones. He just didn't mention it? As they docked, the man approached. There was something odd about his movements, something fluid and unnatural that reminded the captain of underwater footage he'd once seen of octopi navigating narrow spaces. The man's smile was wide, his eyes a startling shade of blue that was almost violet. "Welcome to Blackwater Rock," he said, his voice carrying a strange echo, as if many people were speaking at once. "I'm Ethan Holloway." He held out a worn leather notebook, the words "The Rules" scratched deeply into its cover. The woman noticed that an 8th rule had been added, in fresh ink. 8. If you hear someone claiming to be Ethan Holloway, do not listen. Behind them, the lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its lantern already lit against the coming night. Within its light, shadows moved that had nothing to do with the turning of the lens, waiting for night to fall on Blackwater Rock once more. For the bargain must be kept, and the light must never go out.